you will see that reality is in fact much larger than we tend to believe it is. And again, yeah, psychedelics are great ways to jumpstart that exploration into your own hero's journey.
I'm Heather Grzych, and this is the Wisdom of the Body podcast. This podcast explores the idea of body intelligence as the real key to learning the knowledge of life, or what we call Ayurveda in the ancient language of Sanskrit. We do that by connecting with today's creative leaders and experts who will help you listen to your body, trust your gut, and live in deeper harmony with nature. Come join me as we unlock the golden door to clear, direct perception and become very deep listeners. You can find the Wisdom of the Body podcast on Apple, Spotify, and Stitcher. You can also follow us by joining my email at heathergrzych.com or on Instagram at heathergrzych. I know you're going to love this podcast, so take a second right now to subscribe. Today, I'm here with Zach Leary, who is a podcaster, a writer, a cognitive dissident, a yogi, and a psychedelic advocate. So he grew up in Beverly Hills in the 1980s and came to realize that the man who often took him to school in the morning and tossed the ball with him in the backyard was not only one of the instigators of the counterculture movement of the 1960s, but also had a front row seat to some of the most important cultural movements of the late 20th century. This led Zach to create a path for himself that's been rich with many different incarnations, ranging from digital marketing ace for Apple to futurist to psychedelic integration specialist and advocate. And first, Zach, it's really nice to be interviewing you. I've been wanting to interview you for a while, and I'm so glad that we're doing this. And so thank you so much for being here with me today.
Oh, thanks, Heather. Thanks for having me. Pleasure.
Yeah, you're such a fascinating person to me. I'm excited to get to know you. And, we were joking around before we started today that you and I both have kind of slower, kind of calming voices. And this will be a really relaxing episode for everybody to listen to as you pet your lovely dog there.
Good boy. He's a good boy. Yeah. Well, I hope it's relaxing and soothing for everybody listening to it. If we need to spice it up and talk quicker, we can do that too.
Well, I might ask you to pull out your harmonium because I saw that you do kirtan. So we'll see. Yeah. So I listened to part of the interview where you were interviewed by Joe Rogan, and I was kind of annoyed that he seemed to be cutting you off all the time. I want to give you a lot of space to talk. I just want to hear you go on and on and on forever. So I hope you can commit to that today.
Yeah, I can commit to that. I mean, yeah, that particular experience wasn't the best podcasting experience I've ever had, which was unfortunate because, that's one of those experiences where your ego really tested my ego because, you wanted it to go so well because it's such a big platform, obviously, the biggest podcast kind of there is. And it just was one of those things that just didn't, we didn't really completely sync up with each other. And I had to kind of leave disappointed, but I'm glad I had the experience. But,
yeah,
sometimes it's just that way.
Yeah. Well, you said in your bio that you're a cognitive dissident, and I thought that was a fun play on words. Can you describe what a cognitive dissident is?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that definitely changes over time what it is that you are championing and what kind of cognitive idea that you want to keep alive. I think what it basically means is that you are cognitive dissonant, questions authority in a thoughtful way, kind of tries to go against the standard cultural norms or cultural ideas and kind of challenge them in a positive way, in a way that allows people to think for themselves and to kind of look at the systems that we're always being shown and all the systems that we're asked to conform to, and to maybe look at them in a different way, because I think our world is really so full of what we're supposed to be doing, and especially in the West, it's a very standardized, K through 12 and go to college and then join a corporation or work a 9-to-5 job. And it's a very routine way of living. And for some people that works. For me, it didn't, and so I encourage everyone who perhaps doesn't feel satisfied or fulfilled in the method or the routine that they've been conditioned to believe, to question it and to do what makes them feel happy.
Well, I share that history as well and really relate to that. And you host the MAPS podcast. And I'm just going to assume that
Hmm.
somebody listening does not know, one, what MAPS is, and also does not even know what psychedelics are. So can you first describe for an alien who's landed here on Earth, first of all, what is a psychedelic? And then tell us about MAPS.
Yeah. So psychedelic medicines or psychedelic drugs, psychedelic plants, psychedelic compounds, whatever word you choose. These days, there are a lot of people who are very intent on calling them psychedelic medicines, trying to move away from the drug label because, it can be so polarizing to some people. I myself, it doesn't really matter to me what you choose to call it, but yeah, so psychedelic plants and synthetic compounds. I mean, psychedelic plants have been around and been used by humanity pretty much since the dawn of time. Psychedelic mushrooms, magic mushrooms, ayahuasca, cannabis, all of those things have been used by indigenous cultures for literally thousands and thousands of years. And every indigenous tribe across the globe has some connection to some mind or mood altering psychedelic compound. So if you trace your family lineage back far enough, you too will have a connection to some use of some psychedelic sacrament that was used for ceremonial purposes thousands of years ago. And for whatever reason, which is a very long story, psychedelic compounds really kind of went dark for hundreds and hundreds of years and really stayed in very small indigenous pockets across the globe. And we're just kind of swimming along fine for hundreds and hundreds of years. And then in the mid 20th century, they got introduced to the West for really the first time on a massive level. Things like mushrooms, LSD, and what we're seeing today. We're seeing a lot of research done with mushrooms and LSD, but also with MDMA and ketamine and things like that. Because in the simplest way to define it, psychedelic compounds are, when used properly, when used safely, when used wisely, are tools to induce a non-ordinary state of consciousness that can change your life, whether that is through a mental health affliction, wanting to grow spiritually and connect with God on a deeper level, wanting to look at your overall holistic wellness or purpose on the planet in a different way. Psychedelics are great tools to kind of spark a new way of looking at the world. Because I think one thing about being alive on the planet as a human being is that we tend to think that the reality that we see around us is all that there is. And we take it at face value that, well, this is it, right? But I think if you do any sort of method like psychedelics or deep meditation or yoga or tantra or breath work or anything that induces a non-ordinary state of consciousness, you will see that reality is in fact much larger than we tend to believe it is. And again, yeah, psychedelics are great ways to jumpstart that exploration into your own hero's journey. Yeah, and MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, is the primary leader in really jumpstarting the modern psychedelic renaissance that's kind of coming in the form of psychedelic assisted therapy. And they are leading the charge at making MDMA a legal prescription drug for the treatment of PTSD.
And MDMA is ecstasy, known as ecstasy, right?
It's known as ecstasy. Yes, it is. But there is some gray area around that, because what we do know as ecstasy or Molly in the kind of circuit may not be pure MDMA, which is a problem, which has led to a lot of social misunderstandings around MDMA. It's a very complicated compound to make. And because of that, a lot of impure MDMA, especially in the pressed pill form that you find like in the rave scene or something, is not pure MDMA. It's cut with perhaps too much methamphetamine or too many other things. And the impurity of that has led to a lot of problems. But yes, it is ecstasy, but MDMA in its purest form is what's known as ecstasy. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. Well, there's several substances, and it's funny, I was geeking out this morning on, because, everybody always asks me as an Ayurvedic practitioner, they're like, what about weed? What about mushrooms? Do you guys recommend that? Because we're herbalists, right? And we use plants as medicine and stuff like that. And a lot of these substances are really like frowned upon in the Ayurvedic community. I would
Hmm.
say, from the practitioners that I've learned from, I will say. And so I whipped out one of my favorite books, one of my favorite like Ayurvedic pharmacology books,
Hmm.
and it has banga in it, which is cannabis. Maybe that's where we got the word bong, but definitely that's where the word ganja came from. And so like in the Dravya Guna, which is essentially Ayurvedic pharmacology, massive book that I, used in Ayurveda school getting my master's degree, it's a legit herb in there, that is used in medicine. So I wouldn't say it's universal, but yeah, the reputation of things is really interesting, like you said, because of the medicinal use versus the kind of fun recreational thing. And I found some data and I wanted to run it by you because you probably have more recent data than I do being in the field. But I read that in 2019, there was a study that came out of Columbia University that said that past 12-month LSD use had increased from 0.9% in 2002 to 4% in 2019. So from 2002 to 2019, it went from less than 1% to 4% of people reporting that in a given year, they are using LSD. I was like,
Yeah.
wow.
That's probably true. And if you add mushrooms to that and MDMA to that and cannabis is a low grade psychedelic as well. Number increases dramatically. I think part of the psychedelic renaissance, I guess what we're calling the modern era of psychedelics, which is really the last 15-ish years. One tremendous benefit about it is, there have been so many clinical trials done in very prestigious medical institutions and universities like Johns Hopkins, NYU, UCLA, and so much of that data, America's a very data-driven society, and that has really redefined the narrative around safety around using these substances. And it's given people sort of like permission to come out of the closet, to look past the taboo, look past all the crazy BS disinformation that was propagated through the war on drugs about these substances, and come to find out that that's not true. LSD, if you take it, it won't make you want to fly and jump off a building. Or if you take MDMA, it won't drain your spinal fluid. These are all absolutely 100% false narratives that were created by the government as a result of the war on drugs propaganda. They're just completely untrue. That doesn't mean that psychedelics are free for all and everybody should be taking them all at once, all the time. Of course, they should be safely and wisely, but when done so, it can be extremely, extremely beneficial for your life. And yeah, and back to the thing what you're saying about, in the Ayurvedic world, I'm not an expert in Ayurveda, but I spent a lot of time in India, studying yoga and bhakti yoga and the more Vedantic philosophy behind yoga. And there are so many different schools, and if you get into the doshas around Ayurveda and Vata, Pitta, and yeah, maybe taking a certain medicine might kind of temporarily increase one of those. And it's also done as well and said in some yogic schools as well that like taking intoxicants makes you less sattvic or something like that. Mm-hmm. But then there are other schools, too, of the yogic tradition that use cannabis all the time as a holy sacrament. And there is very solid archaeological evidence that some of the ancient seers and wise men of ancient India used mushrooms as well. So I don't know. I just don't think that any school of science, health, or wellness should be completely dogmatic about anything. I think anything used safely and wisely can have beneficial purpose. And I do think that there's a place for yoga and Ayurveda and psychedelics to all work together. It's not an either or proposition.
Yeah, very well said. And, also considering that Ayurveda in the US is kind of this unknown thing that doesn't really have an evidence base. And I mean, there's probably even a lot for us as a field to learn. Psychedelics, I think there's a lot for us to learn from the work that's been done with cannabis as well in the United States. So we tend to focus on how things are done in India. And we have to figure out like how should it all be done here so that people can really benefit and use things safely. So because you host the MAPS podcast, is it weird for you to be interviewed by someone else?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I've been on a lot of podcasts in my years. No, it's all good. I mean, it certainly depends on the person and depends on the questions that are asked. I mean, there are certainly some questions that I'm certainly tired of answering, of course, but
Which ones are those? I won't
oh,
ask them.
yeah, I mean, like, what was it like growing up with Timothy Leary? I mean, that's been asked and answered more times than I even can remember, so I
Mhm.
don't really have anything new to say on that.
Yeah, it's hard. It's funny. That wasn't the question I was going to ask you specifically. So I believe that if Timothy Leary did not exist and do the work that he did, that I would not have studied Ayurveda.
Hmm,
Yeah, let
yeah.
me tell you the connection. So, because of essentially the movement and the relationship between Timothy and Ram Dass writing Be Here Now, and all the white hippies going to India,
Hmm,
snatching the gurus, come lead us back here in America on our ashram, I'll live with you. So, Mount Madonna, where I went to Ayurveda school, was formed around Baba Hari Das,
yeah.
who was the silent monk.
Yeah.
And he took a vow of silence in 1952. And I'm embarrassed to say, I've never read Be Here Now. What I was told was that he was one of the people featured in that book, or somehow became famous
Hmm,
because of that book. And so people went to India to look for him and then brought him here. And then
yeah.
because that was formed at Mount Madonna, they started the Ayurveda program eventually. I mean, it was a bunch of young white hippies with this silent guru, and they didn't have any schools, and they started having kids and getting married, and they formed a school and they made a little community. And then they, eventually started teaching Ayurveda there and brought Vasant Lad from India, and he started teaching there, and that started to form more of the Ayurveda education. Eventually they created an institute with an Ayurveda program that just happened to be here in the San Francisco Bay Area, which I could drive to on the weekends when I had my corporate job.
It's all
That's
connected.
it for sure. And I think a lot of the yogis around today and a lot of the Ayurvedis around today really need to understand these connections between
Yeah.
the psychedelic movements and the substances and the activities that occurred in those times and the people, and how we came to connect with these Indian sciences.
No, I mean, I'm so glad that you're talking about that. It's a great topic and one that I try to talk about often. If it weren't for the psychedelic use, Ram Dass or Richard Alpert would have never gone to India to become Ram Dass. One thing directly led to another. And the influence of Ram Dass, and I'm just so blessed to have considered him my main teacher and mentor in life, and so blessed that I got to spend so much time with him. Someone told me that in 1967 that there were something like only 4 or 5 places in all of America to practice asana. That's it. And you cannot underestimate, the importance of Ram Dass, who really there were others too, but he almost single-handedly brought Eastern mysticism and all of the various yogic practices to America. Be Here Now, that shot that Be Here Now fired was just so, so loud. And that led to the mindfulness movement, to the Ayurvedic movement, to the asana movement. And now, I mean, look at asana yoga. There's a yoga studio in kind of every town in America. And Ayurveda is, I mean, better than I do, but it's not like most people who are kind of at least somewhat progressive or turned on. They know what it is,
Mhm.
And yeah, and that all started the domino effect that psychedelics had in the 1960s, for all of this. But it also led to, it was a huge part of the fuel behind the anti-Vietnam movement, the women's rights movement, the sexual liberation movement, the civil rights movement. Psychedelics really encouraged or really turned on this whole younger generation that, who were growing up, the generation before in the 40s and 50s, where they were using alcohol and smoking cigarettes, and that was it. And psychedelics really just opened up this whole kind of doorway into an expanded consciousness, and how that trickled into the social movements of our time for health, wellness, politics. Yeah, it's amazing. And those connections are really strong. And I'm glad that you talked about it, especially when, in the yoga community, I come across a lot of yogis who are very, I don't know, maybe this is just my stuff, but they're very high and mighty about like intoxicants and, oh, I don't need those to get there. I can get there just by doing asana and meditation. And, hey, if that's your thing, that's your thing. But knowing the history and knowing that you would not be saying that if it weren't for psychedelics in the first place, it's really important to understand.
Yeah. And, I'll say to kind of go back to something that you were talking about earlier about, I'm not going to say exactly the way you said it, but as a way to transcend the aspects of culture that may need to be updated. And I picked out a bunch of books this morning. I don't usually do this before I interview people, but there were a bunch of books that came to mind before I was going to interview you. And one of them was that pharmacology book that I was noodling through this morning, the Dravya Gunam, the Ayurvedic pharmacology book, because we're talking about substances, right? One of them also was, have you read this book, Obedience to Authority? The Stanley Milgram.
Oh, the Milgram. Yeah, that's the Stanford prison experiment.
I don't think it was in
Oh,
prison.
okay.
It was the one where they like zapped people
for
getting an
sure.
incorrect answer.
Yeah, totally.
And there's also kind of, for the Cliffs Notes version of it, a really great movie on Netflix called Experimenter, which kind of like summarizes the book. I loved that movie so much that I went out and actually read his whole book and all of his studies. And I read it before the pandemic started. And so I got fascinated by this idea that, because what the data shows is that in any given time, like 2/3 of people are just going to like do what they're told. And in a situation where they feel like there is some sort of like compensation involved. And, they studied only situations where compensation was involved, I believe, and in the main studies. But only like 1/3 of the people, for example, in these studies that they did, what would happen is you're going to answer, you're brought in as a test taker. They're saying, all right, Zach, you have to come in and you have to ask somebody these questions. If they get them wrong, you have to zap them with electronic voltage and you get a sample of what the voltage feels like. So you have a sense of what it feels like in your body and what you're going to be doing to them. And then they got this person on the other side and you zap them and you keep zapping them. And some people will keep zapping even to the point where they know that somebody's like, oh my God, I have a heart condition. Like 30% of people would keep zapping. And I was like, wow, what does that say about us as humans, that of what we're capable of doing to other people with not negative intentions, but what is that thing? And it was about obedience.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, it does become, though, I mean, it's sort of like, when you create power structures, right? Eventually, power structures crumble and become insidious, like, I don't know, it's a controversial thing to talk about, but like, let's just say for argument's sake that the majority of people who want to become police officers, right? Maybe they initially do so because their intentions are good, right? And it's an ideology they buy into, and maybe they do think that they can do good, right? But over the course of time, they'll become indoctrinated into the power system that the police are part of. And, the dark side of shocking people and zapping people does come to fruition, and you start to see their behavior kind of, it changes course and they start abusing their power. And I mean, look at the problem that we have with the police right now. And in cities all around America, police abuse is out of control. And I don't think that's because people are fundamentally bad. I think it's because, when certain people become part of a power structure, they lose their sense of morality. They lose their compass. I mean, look at Memphis beating a few months ago. What was really interesting about that one is that it was not race. The officers involved in the African-American motorists, the officers were also Black. So that one was really interesting because it wasn't about race. It was about power. I mean, it seems throughout human history, you give too many people power and they abuse it. I think it's a problem within humanity that we can't seem to reconcile.
And it also says that, we're willing as individuals to ignore, because empathy, you can't ignore empathy. When you feel it, right? So the question is the empathy not there? or is it just being ignored? And one of the things I observed, and I can't remember if it was in the film or if it was in the book, but it was that the person who couldn't zap was like a person who had relatives who were killed in the Holocaust, who somehow related to the injustice of
Yeah.
it, and they couldn't do it, and what does it take for us to get empathy for other humans and to allow that to trump other things that we might deem as important to our safety and survival?
Yeah. I mean, that's really the $100 million question, right? That's the thing that we're all striving for. And it's a conversation that, I know it's a lot of great people are kind of having out there, and even in like mainstream TED Talks and things like that. How do we increase the empathy quotient? How do we increase vulnerability? How do we increase compassion and understanding for one another? Because I think, yeah, I mean, we're at a fever pitch in humanity right now. And unless we figure that out, these problems are just going to escalate more and more and more. I mean, I certainly don't have the answer for the how, but I do think that something that certainly wouldn't hurt is for people to start engaging in practices that are kind of outside of the normal traditional structure of American life. That is just K through 12, work, go to church, rinse and repeat, And if you start being of service in any way possible, if you start meditating, if you start doing yoga, if you start maybe using psychedelics, if you start, yeah, I mean, anything like that, participating in harm reduction or whatever it is, kind of getting outside of your traditional self-centered comfort zone, that is a surefire way to at least start cracking the wall that makes it all about you and starts like kind of making you a more empathetic person. I'm trying to think of an example. I mean, I'm from Los Angeles, and, I know anybody who's done any outreach work in the homeless community in Los Angeles immediately will have some kind of takeaway, some kind of palpable effect that will change their view around how to solve a homeless problem, for instance. Because right now we see it as just, oh, not in my backyard, these terrible people, and they need to get jobs. But if you go and you live with them and experience them with them and, and see their struggle and empathize with them a little bit, your view changes. And that goes around criminality, social justice reform. We've got to kind of get our hands dirty in the things that we don't understand, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's hard, but we need to.
It's so funny because with yoga, even, I
Yeah.
feel that the same kinds of stuff can happen in a yoga community, even, where you think you're doing the thing that the guru wants you to do. Or it's like, because yoga in and of itself ends up having a power structure, as evidenced by all these like fallen gurus in the last couple of years, sadly, that these things then can play out there where we don't listen to those inner guides, as well. But then we think we do because we're doing yoga,
Oh man. Yeah, it's a huge one, and I mean, I've been part of the yoga system and the guru system. I'm still part of the guru system, but like, if you're giving your power over, like all of your power over implicitly to the control of someone else's thing, 9 times out of 10, it will turn ugly. I mean, sure, there have been many gurus out there that have been really saintly and really, really amazing people, but that's it. They're just people, I mean, sure, there have been some Indian saints who have been probably enlightened, as was the Buddha, as was Christ or something, as was Muhammad. But, we have to keep in mind that in the modern day world, if you get involved in something like that, they're just people too. And you have to be really, really careful about who you're giving your power over to and not completely, relinquishing control and still holding on to some of your individuality and autonomy and free will.
How do you think
I
we
guess,
know that?
well, it's hard though, because like, I understand the seduction of cults and the guru system and all of those things because we're all looking for belonging, right? We all want to belong to something. And when you find a community that takes you in and feeds you and loves you and you're a part of it, it's very attractive. And it is. I think it has to do with your kind of the state of who you are going into something like that. If you're going into something like that lost and weak and impressionable and gullible and have no sense of your own compass at all, then, you'll get swept up into it. But if you go into it like kind of strong and self-assured and confident, then those things can maybe help you. They can add another layer of beauty or guidance or peace or serenity to them. But it's a really, really fine line. Yeah, it's a really fine line. I don't know. It's tricky.
Yeah. So this idea of being a futurist, right?
Oh,
How did this come about? Like, are you writing science fiction? Like,
no, nothing like that. I mean, the book I'm writing about, it's about psychedelics, the culture of psychedelics and how we got to this point, looking at the future of psychedelics and seeing how best it can move forward in a constructive and helpful way, and how people can best use these compounds safely, wisely, effectively. I mean, I guess as sort of the futurism thing goes, the latter kind of chunk of my father's work and nothing to do with psychedelics whatsoever. He moved on from that years and years before, and was really kind of embracing the early cyberpunk movement and the early internet movement, and really saw that as kind of this great kind of panacea of how information and ideas could be exchanged across the globe. I mean, I got my first computer in 1981, an Apple II Plus, and I never really looked back. And I always have thought, I think technology, I mean, what we've seen happen in the last 100 years, are the evolution of humanity in relationship to technology and the world around us has advanced more than it has in the previous 5,000 years. The last 100 years, it's been such a rapid acceleration that at one point I just kind of saw that and was like, well, look, you have two choices. You can embrace it, or you can push it away or reject it. And like, yeah, I don't want any part of that. I got to get back to nature, and technology just freaks me out. But I get that. But on the other hand, it's like the train has left the station. It's like the way that data and the algorithm and, what we're seeing with AI right now and things like Chat GPT. I mean, they're incredibly powerful movements that I think it's best to learn how to use them before they use you. I think that's what it comes down to. There is a way for you to control the algorithm rather than being just susceptible to it and find yourself doom scrolling all day long. You can control the algorithm if you do know what you're doing and you're smart enough and insightful enough to kind of get ahead of it. Otherwise, you'll just sit back and get programmed. And that's the detrimental effects of that, as we see in like Gen Z today, are really, really powerful. And I think it's a cautionary tale. So in some ways, yeah, technology is, it can be a very, very powerful tool and kind of elixir for mankind, but it can also be a cautionary tale too. And it's something we really have to be careful of. I mean, look how young women today growing up with TikTok, for instance, and how body dysmorphia and self-acceptance and body positivity and sexuality, how all those things are so warped, and it's incredibly sad. And that's really just because people, are falling victim to it.
It's not just Gen Z. I have friends of mine where I look at them on social media and I'm like, your lips don't look like that. Your eyes don't look like that. I know you. I've seen you in real life, and that's not what you look like.
So true.
And I'll tell you what, because I remember I did this filter and it was like, it did something to my face and then it gave me these like angel wings. I was like, wow, that is so cool. But I couldn't imagine, like, because I had this high like fantasy element to it. I couldn't imagine wanting to change. I don't know. It's hard. It's hard being a woman. Obviously the beauty piece seems bigger for women than it is for men. I mean, women have to dye their hair when they get old, and men are told they're sexy when they turn into the silver fox. And so I think the visual stuff is definitely different for women. So I saw this on social media yesterday or the day before, and I was like, this will be a great thing to talk with Zach about, because, okay, so a friend of mine posted somebody had basically recreated using AI, the image and the voice. And I can't remember if it was a video or if it was just image and voice of Alan Watts, and, asked him, what do you think humans should do about AI today or whatever? And then Alan Watts delivered, and it didn't sound exactly like him, to be honest, but it was close enough. And here you go with Alan Watts delivering this whole speech about how we all need to like be here on Earth and having a sensory experience. And it was really beautiful. It was very Alan Watts like, and maybe he probably would have said something like that. And then there was this weird thing about it to me because I actually met his daughter and I tagged her on Facebook because I wanted her to see that like people are recreating your dad. They're trying to recreate your dad. And I was just kind of curious, also having somebody in your family who is, very famous and stuff like that. How would you feel if people started like recreating Timothy Leary? And how would you feel about that if you saw that?
Yeah, it's already happened. There's been some audio already generated. Boy, I don't know. On one hand, I would think about my dad, and I'm thinking, like I was saying, at the end of his life, he was such a futurist. So I think part of it, he would kind of have this chuckle about it, like, oh, he's alive in cyberspace, and he would find great pleasure in it, But on the other hand, and this gets scary for any public figure, if you start creating things that they didn't say and start kind of creating narratives around things that they actually never said, and that somehow becomes a soundbite that makes its way into the public vernacular, then it's really troubling. It's frightening.
Because how would
And I
we
don't,
know? Yeah.
how would we
Especially
know?
like these younger generations, there are probably people here listening right now who don't know who Timothy Leary is. They
Yeah.
don't know who Ram Dass is,
Yeah.
and they might come in contact with some generated version of them instead of.
Yeah, no, it's really problematic. I mean, I know people like Alan Watts, like his daughter and his son, and Ram Dass has the Love Serve Remember Foundation, and Timothy Leary has a lot of people looking after his legacy, including myself. And hopefully, if something makes it out there that seems to be egregious, and like we can flag it and take care of it right away. I know YouTube is already implementing compliance rules for content owners for things like that. If something gets out there, and you can immediately flag it and get it taken down. But as we know, everything lives on the internet forever. And, these things have been going on. There's been happening for years now. I mean, you'll see celebrity sex tapes that don't exist,
Mm.
but the CGI is so accurate that it really looks real.
Oh man. I wonder
Like
how I would feel if that ever happened. That would never happen to me like in real life, but that would be really weird to see that about yourself.
right? I guess. I don't know. I know I read something though, which was a Scarlett Johansson. There's a lot of fakies out there of her, and her point of view on it was that her relationship with it, I thought was just so healthy and refreshing, and I really admired it a lot because she just was like, yeah, I know in my heart of hearts, I would never let a sex tape get out. So I know it's not real. And if that's how people's minds work, and there's nothing I can really do about that. I know it's not me, so whatever.
That's so interesting because I feel like one of the themes that has come up a lot is just this idea of consciousness and thought and experience and imagination. And maybe we didn't talk about it in explicit terms, but these are all sort of movements of our minds, right? That are happening in time and space. And, when we're talking about knowing who we are as humans and, not succumbing to the waves of things that can sweep us up. It's all so related. And maybe the AI is just like one more thing about that. Cause I've used some of these AI tools to write content. I'll
Mhm.
be like, oh, I just need like something to get me started writing something, and
Yeah.
then I'll like do something. And it feels like a wave that's moving through me. And if I receive it, I can play with it. And then in the end, it'll come out like something that says Heather. And if I don't play with it, if that
Yeah.
wave comes through me and I just let it come through me and I regurgitate it exactly as is, it's not going to have any of Heather on it. I will have not owned any of it. I will have not put my stamp on it. And I would imagine that people would really feel it differently and see that it would lack that authenticity.
Yeah. I mean, this is probably the most like current hot button issue to be talking about right now, because I mean, what ChatGPT is doing and Google's Bard is going to be doing for the future of academia and the future of journalism is really complicated. Because like you said, yeah, and I've used it too to like generate a paragraph or two that as a thought starter. And then I'll write something after it, and it ends up nothing like the first two paragraphs at all. And I end up getting rid of them, what was generated to me, but it could be a good thought starter. But then, like, yeah, I think, I mean, where it really terrifies me is journalism. It's like, newspaper journalists, like whose jobs can be completely automated now. And that's kind of tragic. And I just really hope that humanity will course correct itself and not fall too far in that direction. Or, I mean, one thing about kind of upper level academia, AP high school and above and college and above, is that writing an essay or, writing a term paper on something really required you to read and be thoughtful and to really take in the information and to reflect on it and to kind of show that reflection back. And if that gets lost too, if somebody can just, I mean, gosh, there was ChatGPT-4 passed the bar exam.
Oh,
It passed the California bar exam. And that is like, wow, oof. It's a brave new world. We need to figure it out.
oh, wow. We definitely do. Yeah. I think the word that keeps coming to mind, like, is embodying the information, rather than just letting it.
Regurgitating it. Yeah.
Yeah. Hmm. Well, we didn't get to talk a whole lot about the work that you do in integration and advocacy and psychedelics, but do you want to talk a little bit about that and why you think it's like so important for people today?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I spend most of my time, I mean, I am writing my book, I speak, I do the MAPS podcast, and I'm also a facilitator and do integration work as well. But I facilitate in around the Austin area, but also in Jamaica at a retreat center called Evolution Retreats, because it's legal in Jamaica. But yeah, my focus is really on harm reduction and keeping kind of the sacredness of psychedelic use intact, because the medicalized model of using psychedelics just to treat mental health, while very effective, it has kind of stripped away some of the ritual and sacredness behind it. And with the integration work, I mean, integration in its simplest form means taking your psychedelic experience and assigning meaning to it. So it doesn't just become just some random far out thing that happened. You don't know what to do with that download and you're confused because it was so ethereal and different. And like, oh my God, well, what do I do with that? How can that help me better my life? But if you work with somebody who is kind of skilled in the psychedelic world and can help you piece together those parts, it can really make your psychedelic experience that much more valuable and useful and hopefully long lasting as well. Yeah.
It doesn't sound all that different than a person who might want to go and do like an Ayurvedic cleanse and they
Hmm.
have this really big, shifted state of various sorts, and then they have to go back into their life and their life is exactly the way it was before in the physical world, in their day-to-day routines and the people they have that live in their home and in their town and in the physical space is where they are. And it's about space and time. It's like you saw that something else was possible, right? Through this experience. And now, how do you make it so in your real life?
Yeah, no, that's a beautiful, beautiful example, right? It's like, how do you integrate back into your world, with your family, your friends, your relationships, your partner, your job? How do you take these experiences and make them benefit all of those things as well, right? Because that's ultimately the goal, right? And I think it's with Ayurveda as well. I mean, it's great, of course, to make your body healthy, right? But how does that make your life better? It's if your body is healthy, but you're still an asshole, then it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. So hopefully you get more from it than that.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to share this story. There was a woman who had been, when I was in clinic recently, there was a person who had experienced some pretty profound changes and suddenly started to, in the form of like a large weight loss, like losing 100 pounds or something. And,
Mm,
everything about you changes in that moment. And even your thoughts can start changing the way that the information starts gets processed through you. And it was so fascinating because everyone else in her life was still interacting with her like she was still the other person. They didn't know how to interact with her as this new person. So it's like a learning. When we change, the whole group around us has to be recalibrated.
right. And the really big thing with that, and I experience this in my work all the time in doing psychedelic work, is that people can experience such a profoundly huge shift that they go back into their life and they kind of see that so many things aren't working. And sometimes it can be a really brutally honest and difficult transition, especially around work and romantic relationships.
Yeah.
I've seen so many people kind of get really turned on from a psychedelic experience, and they realize, like, what am I doing with this partner? This is not the person for me. And I've just been too afraid to do anything about it. I've been living in fear, or I work in a job that makes me absolutely miserable, and look, I mean, those are difficult things to face. There's no doubt. And, some people might say, well, ignorance is bliss, but I think you've got to make the difficult choices, especially if you waste away in a relationship or a job that is not serving your highest self. Then there's a problem. There's a problem. And if that's what it takes to wake up, if it takes what is it? Is it 14 days or 21 days for Ayurvedic cleanses?
Oh, I mean, they could do one in a day, but yeah, a lot of times it's a couple of weeks, even like 7 to
Yeah.
like 21 days. Yeah.
I signed up for a 14-day in Kerala, and I admit I only made it to day 8. It was in late May in Kerala, India, and it was so hot already that I couldn't make it. It was really unfortunate. I would try it again in a different place. But if it takes an Ayurvedic cleanse or a psychedelic experience or something to really shake up your truth, then by all means go for it.
Mm.
And hopefully they could find you to coach them if it's Ayurveda.
Okay, Zach, last question here. What does the wisdom of the body mean to you?
Well, the older I get, the more attuned and sensitive I have become to the notion that our experiences, our successes, our traumas, our joys, our failures, our pains, the things that turn us on, the things that turn us off, the things that cause us sadness, the somatic relationship to them is just as important as the emotional or intellectual relationship to them. And that ideas, thoughts, emotions are stored in our body as well. And the wisdom of the body means listening to that, really listening to your body's intuition, listening to what your body is telling you, and engaging in practices and attunement that increases that intuition frequency so that wisdom can speak to you, because maybe your body's wisdom might not come through to you in language, It might not just be telling you like, hey, Zach, Heather, do this, ... It might be much more subtle than that. And we're really tuning into the subtle energies and frequencies of your body. And that's where the wisdom lies. And I think more than ever, we're seeing that what holistic health means mind, body, and soul, mind, body, soul, and spirit in equal parts, And if you leave anyone out, you'll be out of whack.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your sweetness today, Zach. And, how should people connect with you if they want to learn more about these retreats you're doing, about the MAPS podcast?
Yeah, you can go to zachleary.net, find all the links there, find me on Instagram, anything like that. Yeah.
Just Google him. You'll find him.
Yeah, you'll find me.
Thanks so much, Zach.
Thank you, Heather.
If you are embarking on a fertility journey and are ready to have your mind blown about what your body is really capable of and how it's impacted by the environment, then check out my book, The Ayurvedic Guide to Fertility. You can actually download the introduction to the book for free on my website at heathergrzych.com. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. Read the intro for free and then buy the rest of this fertility enlightening book pretty much anywhere books are sold. I want to thank you for listening to this show. It brings me great pleasure to provide this content to you. I also want to let you know that I'll be making some very amazing announcements soon. And if you're not already on my email list, then I encourage you to go over to my website and subscribe to my email list so that I can keep you informed about these announcements that are going to be coming up very soon. So my website is heathergrzych.com. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. And I look forward to getting these important announcements to you very soon and connecting. Thank you for tuning in and dropping in with us today. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. I really want to hear your feedback. To learn more about my work, visit heathergrzych.com. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. And meet me here next time on The Wisdom of the Body.